Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I am very excited to welcome Professor Steph Johnson to the show. Steph is an associate professor of organizational leadership and information analytics. She holds the Andrea and Michael Leeds Research Fellowship. She's the director of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative and is a 2020 RIO Fellow. She is a fellow in the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists, or SIOP, and the American Psychological Society. She has published 60 journal articles and book chapters in outlets like the Journal of Applied Psychology and the Academy of Management Journal. Her new book, just published with Harper Collins, called Inclusify, Harnessing the Power of Uniqueness and Belonging to Build Innovative Teams. And in that book, Steph shares the surprising ways leaders undermine inclusion, and she provides actionable ways that leaders can actually pivot to build more inclusive teams and bring value. Steph, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And again, congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to finally see it in print. It just came out June 2nd.
Excellent. And I'm always curious with I love the covers that, these usually designers or illustrators come out with. What was that process for you? Did you sort of have a say? Did you go back and forth, or was that just handled off on its own outside of your responsibility?
Yeah, I love the cover. I feel like it's, everyone tells me this is so beautiful. Like the cover's so great. Good job. But truth, I had nothing to do with it. I love it though. I think they did a great job. They said they would send, we'll send you a few options, but they sent that option. And I'm like, oh, it's perfect. It looks great.
Yeah, I love just the minds of creative types. Like as a scientist and as a psychologist, that's just the mindset I occupy. But when I see like artists, especially like visual artists and graphic designers who do their magic and they turn around these amazing pieces of illustrations and art, I'm so amazed. It's so impressive, much more than like a peer reviewed published paper that we'll that's what we produce, right? So,
yes.
And I agree, it's a very catchy cover,
Thanks.
and we'll get into it in a second. But I figure I want to open with this, and this, forgive me, this is a couple years old, I believe, was a talk that I saw. So I hope I'm not like totally throwing you off here, but I'll set the stage and then pass it over to you. So in this talk, you talk about a chromosomal abnormality, what's called 2XC, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you say that there's some evidence to suggest that it leads to better having this 2XC chromosomal abnormality leads to better managerial and executive performance, and that companies with more 2XC folks on the board have like a 36.4% greater returns.
Yeah.
So what the heck is 2XC and what's going on there?
Well, the question is, would you want to hire people with that chromosomal abnormality based on the data?
Yes. Give me
Absolutely.
all the 2XCs.
I know, right? So it's just 2X chromosomes.
For those listeners who it's been a while for their biology, and what are 2X chromosomes?
It means you're a woman.
There you go. Yes.
There you go. So I like to think in my mind, like I am this like introverted, geeky scientist, but in my mind, I am like this hilarious person. So sometimes I try to be funny and it doesn't always work, but that was trying to be funny.
It was good. It
Thanks.
was very good. So what are we all have heard the stats of like the representation or the underrepresentation of women in senior positions and on boards. Is it improving over the last, say, 5-10 years as we're having more conversations like this and more of it's coming to light? Is it getting better? Are we sort of plateauing? Do you know?
Yeah, we're definitely getting better. I would say since probably 2016 is where I really saw a big shift based on my research. before that, I think we were plateauing since, maybe like the 1980s, that we weren't really getting any better. I think there had been like a slight dip actually in the 2000s in women's representation on the C-suite of Fortune 500 or S&P 1500 companies. But I think something really changed around 2016, 2017. Maybe, there were a lot of data that came out, some of which you referred to from the 2XC thing, but, companies like McKinsey and Morgan Stanley and just like lots of independent groups, not just faculty types like me, but were providing these data showing that actually having women in these top level positions improved or was positively related to company performance. And maybe it's because of that the change started, or maybe it was Me Too or the 2016 presidential election. It's kind of hard to really isolate it, but that's where I really started to see the changes after that.
Right. It seems like there was sort of a confluence of driving factors that sort of we're all coming together. It'll be interesting to see as we come out of this COVID-19 and everything that's happening with Black Lives Matter, of course, into and then of course the October general election. It'll be really interesting to see if it continues along that trend. Do you have any predictions as we head into the 2020s? Maybe a hopeful prediction and then a realistic prediction, or maybe they're the same.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I want out of the 2020s, honestly, but
yeah.
But I have this. This isn't a response to your question, but I have this like handwritten calendar that I use, and it says 2020 best year ever. And every time I look at it, I'm like, that's funny, or I'm gonna cry. I'm not like totally sure. I think I need to throw it away and just buy a new one. But
get a new one, yeah.
So I think, I've been watching really carefully companies' responses to Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And I see a really similar level of activism as we saw around Me Too. And, in a starkly contrasted to what we saw in 2016, there was a similar confluence of events of the murder of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. It was like July 5th and 6th, two different cities, both Black men killed by police officers. And it was like, if you remember back to that time, like it felt kind of like this, like, something has to change. And I don't really think anything changed, but today I feel like it feels a lot stronger and that more companies are responding with not just platitudes. I mean, in 2016, some companies wouldn't even give the platitudes of like, we care. But today I feel like many, many more companies are stepping forward to say, this is unacceptable. And more importantly, tying that response to action. Like we're going to do something different. So it feels different to me, but only, I guess, with continued commitment is it really going to change? So we can't just say, okay, well, I think things are going to be different this time. It's like every individual needs to commit to something that they're going to do to make it different.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing about change is that, and these are a lot of the conversations I've been having with friends and family and colleagues and clients and partners is how does that happen? Does it, and what level of analysis? Like, do you focus on the more organizational level, societal level, cultural level, group level, or is it really driven by the individual level? And it's this emergence, this bubbling up of small micro individual changes that then gives way to the broader forces. And I think it's both, but it's certainly complex to sort of wrap your head around it. That's the way that I'm thinking of it. And what I do find really interesting, I says you're right, is that there's a different feel, there's a different tone to this time around, and maybe it's because of lockdown, maybe it's because of it, the timing of it being happening during a pandemic, but the response from companies and brands, or the lack of response or the certain behaviors that are in the spotlight. So I think I just read this the other day. Is it CrossFit? Have you heard about this?
No.
So it's the CEO or the original founder of CrossFit, I believe. And I'll do it justice and get the link after and put it into show notes for listeners so they can read it up for themselves. But he made basically a comment, fairly crude comment on Twitter or on some social media site, and he experienced a lot of backlash. And there was sort of this sanctioning against CrossFit from gyms across all of North America to cancel partnerships and to remove them from their services. So there's this really interesting response that's happening in the market if you do certain things, or if you also not only that, but if you also choose to be silent as well.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what feels different now than even 2-3 years ago. Would you say?
Yeah, for sure. And I think also, I did this interview with Huffington Post the day before yesterday. Emily Peck, who's just, I think, this amazing writer, was looking at the unseating of many prominent professionals who have made comments like that in the past, even if they were before this current Black Lives Matter movement or after, and them getting fired, losing their jobs, stepping down. And maybe that's a little bit of the Me Too influence as well. Because before Me Too, I think it was like, you did a bad thing, you've been accused of stuff, but that really has little to do with your job. And I think what we saw in Me Too is like, the public, their willingness to spend and invest in brands that they don't believe in, they don't have consistent values and morals, has changed. Like, I think I give the credit to Gen Z and millennials who are just like, no, we have information now. This is the information age. I can choose to work for companies who I agree with. I can choose to spend my money and invest in companies whose values I agree with. And I think that's like taking hold. Like, I feel the same way. If I had the information at my fingertips of what companies I agree with their values and not, that's how I would spend my money. Cause it's, 6 of one, half a dozen or the other. Like, I don't want to I feel like a little bit fearful of naming companies. So I don't want to be like slandering companies, but I'll just give an example nonetheless. But then I'll say I read it online, so it's not really my view, but that Lowe's, the big do-it-yourself store, has invested a ton of money in Black-owned businesses. But historically, but also right now in response to Black Lives Matter. And Home Depot, who's like their major competitor, has not done that. And then some people posted online that one of the founders or owners of the company is also has been a supporter and plans to continue supporting the Trump campaign. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and spend my money at Lowe's. That's just me. And I think more people are doing that today than ever before.
Yes, it's so funny you bring that up. This just yesterday, that came to it came out that was happening, and we have the same in Canada, and it's the same. We have the two big sort of do-it-yourself stores are Home Depot and Lowe's, and Rona, but Lowe's now owns Rona, I believe. Anyway, so we have this Facebook site. I live in a city just outside Toronto called Hamilton, and it's called Hamilton Home Improvement, and it's a Facebook group, and you go and ask questions of like, I need new windows, and sometimes contractors will go on there, and it's actually great. We found somebody who done work around the house, and it's just a wonderful site to go to and share information for do-it-yourself and home reno stuff. Anyway, so a person brought this to light and said, the owner, founder, and these people are donating to Trump, the Trump election, and has done, and so in the past and will continue, and Lowe's, just as you said, and then it just it exploded into this fight, like as you see with like Twitter and Facebook fights, and sort of right versus left, and how we need diversity of thought and diversity of opinion. So it's interesting to see that now businesses and organizations aren't immune to sort of the politics of it all. I think in the past there was a time where they could operate and you could keep it separate out of the arena of politics, especially identity politics. But now it's like you can't. So
Right.
if you're left, you're going to go to those sort of organizations and those brands that appeal to you as a Democrat or as a liberal. Do you think that's a good thing? A bad thing?
Yeah. So that's a very tough question, because I would say for my whole, grown up life, I would have said, like, I don't think that politics should have any bearing on this sort of thing, right? And I still will say that I think that's not true, but I'm gonna like separate politics from racism, hate speech, sexism. Like, I am perfectly willing to invest in companies. I don't care what their political view is, but if they support and promote racist ideology, and then I'm not going to align with them. I think that's maybe the difference. And, I think there's probably been a change over the last 4 years, that I think, under the current administration in the United States, I think there's more of an association between being conservative and that view, of those views of being a bit more racist or sexist than I think that there was in the past. And,
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say that all conservatives are racist and sexist. That's obviously absurd. But I think that divide is becoming like more apparent in the United States. Hopefully that will go away. Like, I don't think we need to make one party like the bad guy and one party the good guy. Like, there's a reason we have two political parties in the US. It's a good thing, right? Like, I deeply believe in the benefit of having diversity of thought. If there was just one right way of doing everything, we would probably have figured it out by now. But it's good to have different views, except when those views are racist.
Yes.
To me, there's no room for that. Like, it's not like, well, it's good that you're racist and sharing those views with us. To me, that's not part of the American spirit.
Right.
So,
Right. And not part of the American spirit, and shouldn't be given the same opportunity to engage in, like, free market trade, and so they should be called out. I think how most people see it. And all of this reminds me of it's a study that came out in JCP, or the Journal of Consumer Psychology, a few months ago. And I actually, with a student of mine, we wrote a little summary piece, which this was not intentional, but it was just published a few hours ago on the blog site. And it's all about brand authenticity, and how this sort of, like, the change in consumer psychology and consumer behavior, especially as you mentioned, like Gen Zs, and especially Gen Zs, but to some extent also in millennials, that there is this preference towards brands to keep it real, to keep it honest, and to sort of have this level of authenticity. And what they find really interesting is that we tend to anthropomorphize our brands. We see them as a human, as sort of an entity behaving and having feelings, and in this case they show having certain motivations. So we know, some of us might know as listeners, there's sort of these two main types of motivation. There's the intrinsic style motivation and extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation, we do things because we really want to do it for the passion, and then the extrinsic is usually for some sort of external reward, like compensation and money. And what they find is that if we perceive a brand as being intrinsically motivated for the good of and the passion of building a product or service to provide customers or users, if they have more of that intrinsic motivation, they see them as more authentic, they see them as more real, and therefore they see them as having higher value compared to those who just want to make money, right? And I don't think that was the case like 10 years ago. Do you think that? Is this a change?
no,
Or
yeah, it's totally a change. And I think that's like been pretty consistently shown. I don't know about if we are more likely to anthropomorphize businesses today than in the past, but I think we care more about their values because, well, I think in part because the Gen Zers are more values driven. They've, grown up based on their generational history, being the first majority minority generation, at least in the United States, and having things like, pronouns being a very large part of their worldview. They care more about that, but also we just know so much more, right? Like when I was a kid, I was like in high school in the 90s. I didn't know what companies' values were. Like there was no like internet, right? How would I look that up? And so like it's just become so different. And now companies, to your point, companies tweet, right? That almost makes them like a person tweeting. They're sharing views.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we can understand more of what companies are about, and with that information, then we can choose where we want to spend our money and who we want to work for. I mean, I think that's the other big one. It's not just how we shop, but it's also where we want to work.
Yeah. Good. Let's talk about the book a little bit.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to go on that much of a tangent. I apologize,
No, man,
but it's really interesting.
it's totally on my mind. Like I can hardly think of anything else.
I know. Me too. So yeah, good. So diversity and inclusion. There's this line that I read, and it says, and again, I got it from the internet, so it might not be true, but at least I think it is. It said, you said it's no use having diversity if everyone feels like an outsider. I find that very interesting. There's been a lot of talk about D&I initiatives in your big organizations over the last 5-10 years. More budget, more mandate. There's chief diversity officers in some of these big Fortune 100 companies. What is this sort of unique history of D&I in these companies, and how did you get interested in it as a psychologist and as a researcher?
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions there. I'm going to maybe start with the last question of how at least I came to study this. It was like not at all my plan. And I kind of joke about this that, so I am a first gen Mexican female in like, so I'm a business professor. I think I'm definitely the only first gen female Mexican business professor in my college, and one of like very few in the United States, I'd say. Very few women, very few people of color. I saw this statistic yesterday that 84% of professors are white in the US. So I actually did not want to study diversity because I was like, well, I'm never going to be able to get a job if I'm like the Mexican woman who studies diversity. Like no one's going to take me seriously. And this is again, like the year 2000. Okay. So it was a long time ago. Now I see how like that is how the system continues to repeat, right? Like if people just study what they're interested in, we might have a greater diversity of what people want to study. But at the time I was like, okay, well, I want to be able to be successful. So I'm going to just like uphold the patriarchy and study leadership. That's like, very mainstream masculine business professor topic. And I love leadership. But before going to graduate school, like one of my first studies as a college student, which I actually published with my other college student friends who did the study, was on gender and leadership. And I'm like, okay, leave that behind. But man, you can't not study diversity if you study leadership, because if you are a careful statistician, you'll see in your data gender differences and racial disparities in leadership. And so much so that like the things that predict success for women don't predict necessarily for men. And the things that predict success for men, like being really assertive, sometimes negatively predict success for women.
Mm-hmm.
And so despite my like desire to not study this stuff, I figured I'm just going to like figure this out, the gender issue, what's going on. And this is like a long time ago. I think now we all are aware of the research showing that when women adopt more masculine styles, they're penalized for violating their gender role. Like, oh, she's, a hard ass or something. And people don't like her. Or if you're super feminine, then you're not very leader-like. But at the time, we didn't know that. So I figured I would just solve that issue. And I I have not yet solved anything. Too bad, for my hopes and dreams. And the more I studied it, I'm just like, dude, I'm pissed. Like, this is actually the most important thing that I'm doing, is studying this, because there's just so much inequality. And the more data you collect, the more you see the inequalities that exist. And I don't know how you turn your back on it. Although I'll admit, even when I applied for my current role at University of Colorado, I didn't speak about my gender or research at all in my job talk, unless someone asked me in interviews, just because I still had that, like, like, it's kind of a niche topic. If I don't know if they'll want to hire me if I'm the person who studies this now in 2020.
And when was your job talk? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it was like 2013, I think.
A lot can change in
I know.
7 years, right?
Yeah, now they're like, I think 4 of the faculty in my group study diversity issues.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Is that the case? I that's probably the case in most big B schools across North America, in the US, would you say?
I think it's something actually quite special about Leeds and my department there at University of Colorado. But I would say it's more common, and among, I'll say, the deans and stuff like that. Like, they're like, this is really important work, not like, oh, that's kind of a niche topic, but this is something that we really value and stand behind as a university. It's a big difference.
That's great. That's really interesting. So back to this line you said, it's no use having diversity if everyone feels like an outsider. So I think most listeners will have a pretty good sense of D&I within organizations, but for those who might not, could you sort of give a Cole's notes of what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought the quote you were going to read was not one of mine, but Renee Meyer's quote, that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. It's one of my favorite quotes. And I think it's kind of what I'm trying to get at. So diversity is like a head count, right? And inclusion, the second half of the D&I function, is helping those people with different demographic backgrounds actually feel like they are a valued and essential member of the team because of those differences. That they don't have to hide those differences. They're not outsiders, but that the company or the team or the organization actually wants to know what your views are. And in a lot of organizations, or in a lot of my research, companies are getting much better at the diversity part. They're like, okay, let's change our selection system. We will recruit from historically Black colleges and try to use dual anonymization to hire people with different backgrounds. But then people get there in the organization and they're left out, ostracized, not valued, made to feel othered, and then they just quit. So it's like a big investment on HR if you're just funneling those that talent into the turnover pool. And so that's what motivated me to write Inclusify. Was, there's a lot of stuff out there on how to increase diversity in terms of hiring practices. In fact, I've written a lot of it, but I think it's more than just doing the hiring and maybe a promotion, but it's like, how can you create an environment where all of those different people can thrive together? And that's inclusion. And so that's what Inclusify is about. It's like, if you're going to do a good job at hiring, then you should do that with this next piece in mind. So you're just not like pouring money and talent down the drain, but you're actually getting the real benefits of diversity, which we see, like the data, the studies show, you get the greatest benefit of diversity when you also have inclusion.
It's interesting that it's, as long as I've seen it progress and develop over the last decade or so, it's always been in combination. It's always been diversity and inclusion. And it's almost like they focus just on the D for the first part. And we're like, oh, let's just get this right. And maybe it was maybe it was good, like genuine intentions and actual good behavior and good values, or maybe it was just sort of to have it on paper. to say, look at the representation. And then they got to the I part and they're like, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I think the I part, and I'm curious if you'd agree with me, is much harder because there's this whole social psychology that's underlying it. Do you think that's how it happened, or do you have
Yeah.
a sort of an alternative hypothesis?
No, I totally agree with you. I think that when inclusion without diversity, I don't really know if that's inclusion, right? Like that you're letting all similar people feel accepted. It's like, okay, that was a really low bar, right? So I think the inclusion only matters after you have actual diversity. And it is harder because if you are part of the majority group, I think the concept of someone not feeling included, it's like you don't really understand what that means. Like, why wouldn't you feel included? I let you in. I included you, right? That's why I
Mm-hmm.
actually made up the word Inclusify, because
Mm-hmm.
it's supposed to be like, it's including people doesn't mean you hired them. That's not including them. It is it's the other stuff, the social psychology part of recognizing that not everyone always feels seen and heard. And so I use the concept of optimal distinctiveness theory, which
Mm-hmm.
says, it's uniqueness and belonging. So it's not just the warm fuzzies of uh, belonging, but letting people know that they belong as their unique and true self. And so that's like a lot of words that doesn't mean a lot, I think, to people, but I like to use examples. And so I think of like, if you can think of a time in your life, and maybe you can tell me what it is, where you didn't feel like you belonged. You were left out, excluded. You were like benched or not picked for the team. Did you ever
Yeah,
have that
yeah. Oh
experience?
gosh, yeah. Now you're pulling up some dark memories. Now, in I played hockey growing up, like as any other Canadian kid plays hockey growing up, um, and not being chosen for certain games or basically what was say being benched. And as a teenager, where like hockey was my complete identity, that felt that was absolutely crushing to my ego as a teenager.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's how all of us feel. We all have that memory, and um, it's never good, right? But then at the same time, if you can imagine or think back on a time where you had to cover in some way, or like maybe you were trying to pass as a US American, or you're sitting in a room with a bunch of people who have different views than you, and so you're like, I'm just going to keep my views to myself.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had one of those moments?
Yes, I'm trying to think of all the time. I'm trying to think of one more recently. I'm opinionated for sure, and it doesn't happen often, but recently I would say with family, there's certain extended parts of my family who are it's considered the more like right leaning Republican conservative minded, and then my immediate family were very much sort of left and Democrat. Um, and I was in a group where I was the only one who was, an identified liberal or Democrat, and everyone else in my extended family there were on the opposite end of the political spectrum, and it got into certain topics and conversations where I was like, "Ooh, I'm just gonna stay quiet for this one."
Yeah,
It'd be
yeah,
yes.
yeah. I have the same. So I think that's the other half of it. It's creating an environment in the workplace where people don't feel excluded, left out emotionally. They feel like they belong, and they get to feel that way while not having to hide those opinions. Like, let's not talk about politics at work, but let's just say if it's work related,
Mm-hmm.
um, being able to share, like feeling the psychological safety to say, like, maybe we should issue a statement about Black Lives Matters, guys. Even though if it's going to be, a not popular opinion, because if you're not sharing those views, then you're not getting the benefit of even having that like different and diverse perspective. And what you would find in 2020 was that if you didn't share those views and you didn't issue a company statement, your company's worse off, right? Kind of how we
Mm-hmm.
started the conversation. So there's a benefit to getting the different perspectives And you're only going to achieve that when people feel like they can be their unique selves and not get kicked out as a result.
Yes. So let's, and I love how you mentioned, and I'll try and like toggle us back and forth between sort of the theory and the more practical examples. But when I first came across what is, I think, that sort of 2x2 dimension of uniqueness and belongingness, the first thing that came to mind, I was like, Marilyn Brewer's optimal distinctiveness theory. I'm like, I love it. It was one of my favorite theories in social psychology that I came across as a young graduate student, and then went into inform much of my work in my PhD, and I did some like minimal group stuff. So can you speak a little bit more about that and what she says and what that work says about being optimally distinct, and how do we actually go about finding that? And we can use the context of, say, organizations, and then the follow-up question is how can leaders, good managers and people managers, how can they support us being optimally distinct?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think the idea is that we have those two basic human needs. We want to be unique. Like if someone asked you, would you rather stand out or fit in? You're kind of like, neither, right? I want to do both. And it's funny because they seem like they're the opposite, but they're not, right? They're like,
Mm-hmm.
you still want to be you want to have some identity that's not just the group, because I think it's part of like our, I don't know, self-actualization or something. Like we want to contribute something special and not just be exactly the same as everyone else. But
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
human nature is to be part of a group. Like there's like a survival benefit to being part of a group. And so it's having your own unique niche as part of this team, where you all fit together and are better than you were as individuals. And as leaders, I think there's kind of like two things going on. That means that you have to like let people see the value in their different perspectives and do a bunch of cohesion building and stuff like that. And that falls along work related things. So like, these are the major tasks that we need to get done. And I want to know your perspective on how to do it, so you feel like you have valuable input for how the work gets done. But then there's also like the softer side of like, feeling involved in like the social aspects, or like who chats. I was gonna say like in the halls, but like that doesn't really make any sense anymore. But like
in the Zoom rooms.
in the Zoom, who's chatting. I mean, I don't know if it's I think it's different in the Zoom rooms, but at work, like I think I have these memories of like, people chatting in the halls to go to lunch together, and I always eat lunch in my office, so maybe I don't really want to go to lunch, but I also don't want to be left out, right,
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
the invite. And so there's kind of both. But if you're just included in the social stuff, but when it comes to like really work getting done and whose opinion you value, you're not included in there like that. I don't think that's that great. And vice versa. If everyone thinks you're brilliant, but never wants to hang out with you, that kind of sucks too. So it's a lot. There's the socio-emotional, the intellectual, and then thinking of the uniqueness and the belonging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something you said there reminds me of something I've thought about before. When it comes to workplace culture, organizational culture, do you see that as a different form of culture than, say, religious culture or political culture? And the reason I ask that is, I know there's some research to show like the best cultures writ large are those that are most cohesive, are those where there's, you know, few dissenters and few amounts of disagreement between the people. But it seems like we're on a track now with books like yours and Francesca Gino's Rebel Talent and Adam Grant's, where we're saying, and even the whole work on psychological safety, to say it's okay to be different, it's okay to say something different, it's okay to go against the grain. So what do we do with organizational and workplace culture if we're saying those things, and how does that sort of fit into these other definitions of culture?
Yeah, so I don't think that the most cohesive team is the best team. I think, I think that's a full belonging approach. And so like in the book, I call that like culture crusaders. All we care about is culture with a little c, like our group culture. We want to hire for culture fit. We want to get rid of people who don't fit the culture and to threaten the culture. Like that's the kind of language that's used. Like if you don't fit in, you're threatening our existence of our culture.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't think those groups do the best. They don't respond to change very well because everyone has like a very shared view. And so like when you have to do something like move your entire company remote or deal with Black Lives Matter and address racial inequality, you don't have the bench strength to do that. And you don't have a history of like really getting innovative ideas out. You have a lot of people who agree. I think that's like groupthink, which I think has kind of been debunked as a concept, but we all learn about groupthink in school. Is when you have a lot of people who are trying to agree for the sake of agreement because that's what's been reinforced and valued. You actually get the best outcome when you have groups that have like a strong, like low relationship conflict. We kind of like each other, but moderate task conflict, meaning I'm willing to say, I don't actually think we should issue a statement. And so I think that's the difference. That's why we're seeing that is because even though we think that we want cohesive groups, it doesn't always get the best outcomes. And I'm thinking of this study, and I can't remember the author, but it was a redo of the classic Solomon Asch conformity study from the 1950s, like three Confederates, which line is the same length as line X. And the first three people who are Confederates to give the wrong answer. And they find that the last guy in the 1950s would knowingly give the wrong answer, even though they could clearly see the right answer in front of their face just to kind of fit in. And then some researchers redid the study in 2018. I think it was like Dartmouth or Harvard or something. And found a couple things that one, we just don't conform as much as we used to. Big shocker in the 1950s. But the other thing they did is made the Confederate group, who, no one knows they're Confederates, but they are racially diverse, and found that in the conditions where the group was diverse, the real participant was even less likely to conform than when it was a homogenous group. And we don't want conformity, right? Like if everyone's just conforming, we're not getting the best answer.
It reminds me also of some data I was looking at the other day on various police forces and groups, organizations in the US with all that's going on right now. And there is a common culture that's manifest with police forces where there's a code almost, and you go along with your fellow cops and your fellow officers no matter what. Like there's just absolutely no room for voices of dissent and disagreement, and is very, as far as I can tell and what I've come across in the research, like it's the opposite of psychological safety. And so in your context, it's the opposite of uniqueness. They're in that, whatever that bottom, I guess, would be the top left quadrant. And we can see why it's glaringly obvious why that is problematic in this case as an organization who's there to protect and serve the community, right? Yeah. So I think that's an interesting example. Steph, one more question for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
So this is the question I ask all guests who come on the show, the BBB, the Big Behavioral Brainstorm. Of all the problems that are happening right now in the world, which one would you say stands to benefit the most, if you had to choose only one, from a psychological or a behavioral framework or approach?
I think it's this concern about equality. I think that is by nature a social psychological process. It's a human behavior. And I think it's the greatest problem that we're facing today, and a problem that can be solved by understanding people's psychology and motives.
And do you see that happening, just as a quick follow-up? How do you see that? Like, what do you think is the best approach? And I'm sure there's multiple different approaches, but yeah, how do you see that? Do you see it as collaborations between basic researchers and academics and practitioners or folks in policy? Like what does a solution look like, or at least start to look like?
At least, in organizations, they'll say there's really great research being done that could inform organizations. We, have a huge shortfall as academics in that we don't write our work to be comprehensible by anyone except ourselves. And so I think if, we can work on that, like we can work on ourselves to try to make our work more accessible. And I think organizations can work on themselves by trying to turn to evidence-based practice and choosing how they run their businesses.
And that is one thing I like most about the business schools in the US in particular, but North America and in, your big business schools, is there's a real effort, I think, for that to happen, for the integration of the two to come together, to make the academics more easily understandable and comprehensible, and the organizations or the policymakers and policy groups to be more open to, like you said, evidence-based decision making. So that's very much in line with my thinking. Well, Steph, thanks so much for coming on. It was a real pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much.
And congrats again on the book.
Thank you.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.